continuing our study of Revelation chapter 1. We're still in verses 13 through 15. In our last study, we looked at those verses focusing on the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. And in this study, we're going to focus on those verses, looking at all the other things that John has to say within this passage. So I'll start out by reading verses 12 through 14, and then we'll jump right into discussing the clothing of the one like a Son of Man. So Revelation 1, 12 through 14. And I turned to see the voice that spoke with me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands was one like a Son of Man. He was dressed in a robe extending down to his feet, and he wore a wide golden belt around his chest. His head and hair were as white as wool, even as white as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame. So the first piece of clothing that we notice here is the robe and the golden belt. Now the early church saw this imagery as referring to Jesus' priestly ministry. Now I think it's important to note that Jesus was not a priest in the Aaronic line, so we shouldn't be concerned that his clothing doesn't match exactly with the Septuagint descriptions of the priestly garb. Because Hebrews makes a big point about how Jesus was not a priest according to the line of Aaron. So Hebrews 5 and 6 says, in the same way, Christ did not exalt himself to become a high priest, but God, who said to him, you are my son, today I have become your father, also says in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So if it is in fact Jesus' priestly ministry that is in view here in Revelation 1, 13 to 14, it's my belief that it's Jesus as the priest, the high priest of the order of Melchizedek that we're seeing here. Now that's just my own thought. That's not in any of the commentaries that I've read. When they talk about the priestly attire, they go back to the Old Testament and look at Exodus and those types of places where the priestly garments are described in the Septuagint. But I don't really think if we are intended to see the priest here, I think it's the Melchizedekian priest that we're supposed to be seeing here. But there are also other ways of understanding these garments that we will get into as well, that I think actually, if we can't see both here, then I actually will lean to the second interpretation. But I'm not sure if it's either or, if it's an either or situation. But if we are looking at Jesus as a priest here in the midst of the lampstands, and that's what scholars who see that link it with. Well, he's in the midst of the lampstands. The lampstands were in the temple. The priest was obviously who would minister in the temple. So Jesus here is in his role as high priest, ministering and tending to the lamps and lampstands. That's how that argument goes, and I do like it. So the priest was responsible for tending the lamps in the temple. He would trim the lamps, remove the wick and the old oil, refill them with fresh oil, and relight the lamps that had gone out. So Jesus here, the Son of Man, the human one, the great high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, Jesus Christ is tending his lamps, which are his people, the church. So I do like that approach. The other main view is that the robe is a mark of dignity or rank. And Robert Thomas and Grant Osborne favor this view. And Thomas says, quote, the weight of evidence favors the more general meaning of dignity when the same two Greek words come together in Ezekiel 9:2. So let me break in here. That's where Thomas wants to go with this, is linking John's Greek to the description of the man in Ezekiel 9 verse 2, where it says that he's clothed down to the feet. So he's linking those terms. So Thomas continues, quote, the man so clothed in Ezekiel 9 has the responsibility of setting a mark on some of the Jerusalemites before the destruction of the rest. This setting of impending judgment from Ezekiel fits one of the principal thrusts of the visions to follow in the apocalypse. In such an environment, Christ is often seen extending mercy to those exempted from the punishments about to fall, very similar to the way some of Jerusalem's people in Ezekiel were passed by, while this man and 6 others engaged in striking down the sinful inhabitants of the city. Christ acts to administer mercy in the midst of God's wrath in Revelation, but never in a priestly capacity elsewhere in the book. In light of these factors, the connotation of dignity or rank, or high rank, is the more probable connotation of this symbol, with the added idea of the wearers functioning in conjunction with judgment, as in Ezekiel 9, end quote. So that's why Thomas prefers the dignity or high rank as what is represented by this robe, because he is going to link it with the judgment that happens in Ezekiel chapter 9, and obviously, as I just read, he links that with the judgment that falls in the rest of Revelation. So if he's correct in that, and if high rank is intended, we can ask how high of a rank is intended. Well, the imagery builds and builds, and as we discussed in our last study, this one, like a son of man, is equated with the Ancient of Days himself in verse 14. So he is the highest rank possible, God. He's God. So the next piece of clothing is the golden belt, and Thomas believes that this detail is here foreshadowing of the judgment of God that will be poured out in the 7 plagues. And I thought that was an interesting connection that he makes, and the reason that he does that is because he noticed that the angels who pour out the 7 plagues are similarly clothed in these golden sashes or belts across the chest. So I thought that was a really interesting observation that he made there, that Jesus' garments here are foreshadowing that judgment, and that those angels are clothed with these similar golden sashes or belts. So if this clothing is intended to foreshadow judgment, which would fit very well with our study on the Lord's Day. So a previous study, when we looked at verse 10, Revelation 1:10, I went into why I believe that the correct understanding of the Lord's Day there is the day of the Lord. And if Thomas is correct here, that the clothing that John describes Jesus as wearing here foreshadows judgment, it would go well with my conclusion of our study of chapter 1, verse 10, that it's the day of the Lord that's in view. And Thomas even notes here, has a note on the phrase Son of Man. He says, quote, "It is a title related to Jesus' capacity as judge, a function that he proceeds to carry out in Revelation 2 and 3, end quote." Now, I mentioned in that previous study that it was my view that Jesus was judging the churches in chapters 2 and 3 because judgment begins at the house of God. Now, if you remember from that previous study, a lot of scholars don't want to see the day of the Lord there because for multiple reasons, each of which we went through in that study, but one of which is because it doesn't seem like chapters 2 and 3 are referring to eschatological judgment. But my point there was that the day of the Lord, and we went through a lot of examples, the day of the Lord doesn't always indicate the very end time judgment, that it can have different temporal applications. So Beale also mentions that Jesus is portrayed in this vision of Revelation 1 as end-time ruler and judge. So I think that fits well with my conclusion of our study of Revelation 1:10 being the day of the Lord. And I thought that it was I thought that it was cool to see a couple scholars suggest that Jesus is also portrayed as judge in Revelation 2 and 3, because I do think that that really is needed. I think that really helps a lot with what I was, my approach of verse 10. So verse 14. His head and hair were as white as wool, even as white as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame. So in addition to the Ancient of Days imagery that we discussed in our last study, white hair also points to wisdom. We see that in multiple places in the scripture. For example, Job chapter 12, verse 12 and 13 says, "Wisdom is with the aged, and understanding in length of days. With God are wisdom and power, counsel and understanding are his." Proverbs 16:31 says, "Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life." And wisdom 4:9 says, "But wisdom is the gray hair unto men, and an unspotted life is old age." So the whitest of white hair points to the Son of Man being the wisest of all, and the Ancient of Days points to his deity. The whiteness, the white hair and the clothing, it may also point to his spotless righteousness. As wisdom says, the unspotted life is old age. And so Jesus is the ancient and righteous one. He is the spotless one. So his eyes were like a fiery flame. Ford here notes, quote, his eyes were like flaming fire. This probably refers to his omniscience, penetrating into all hidden and mysterious things. And then she links that with Daniel 10, verse 6, and 2 Enoch 1:5. She continues, it also qualifies him to judge absolutely, end quote. Schreiner makes a similar statement here. He says, quote, the use of the expression in judgment, let me start that again. The use of the expression in judgment context points to the Son of Man's ability to see below the surface, to penetrate to the deepest level of reality, which means that nothing is hidden from his gaze, end quote. So in the Bible, when it says that God searches the minds and hearts, he sees to the deepest level. So verse 15, his feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. And this is taken from Daniel 10:6, which says, his body resembled yellow jasper, and his face had an appearance like lightning. His eyes were like blazing torches. His arms and feet had the gleam of polished bronze. His voice thundered forth like the sound of a large crowd. And Thomas here, he quotes Bullinger. And he says, Bullinger has summarized thus, the only other place in the whole Bible where we have anything like it is in Daniel 10:5 and 6, where in every particular the resemblance is the same. His girdle is of gold, his eyes fire, his feet as brass, his voice as many waters, and as a multitude, his countenance as the sun, and appearance as lightning, end quote. So that was Thomas quoting Bullinger there. And we discussed in our last study, I mentioned Daniel 10 and how scholars debate who's being described at which point in Daniel chapter 10. So I'll just try to summarize briefly. It's my view that in Daniel 10:5 and 6, it's the second power in heaven, or the pre-incarnate Christ, that's being described. And then later on, when the angel starts talking to Daniel and he says that he was trapped by the prince of Persia and Michael had to come and help him, that is not the second power in heaven speaking. That Daniel sees the second power in heaven, the one like a son of man. He sees Jesus, we'll just say pre-incarnate Jesus. He sees him and describes that appearance in verse 5 and 6. And then Daniel falls down. And then when the angel starts talking in verse 11, it's my view, and it's reflected also in Paul Tanner's Daniel commentary, that is a different individual than the one that Daniel sees. So that is, going through all the details of that will be the subject of, Lord willing, a study on the book of Daniel at some time in hopefully the not too distant future, depending on how long it takes us to get through Revelation, which at our current pace is probably looking like quite a long time. So as I mentioned in our last study, in verse 14, Jesus is described as the Ancient of Days, and in verse 15, he's described as the divine man. And I thought this was pretty interesting because there's a couple ways that we could see the divinity of Christ in verse 15. Actually, I think there's 3 different ways we could see it in verse 15. So first is, if we were to look at Roman artwork in the period in which Revelation was written, Roman artwork that depicted the subject as barefoot indicated that that person, that individual, was in the sphere of the divine. So if John is drawing on Roman artwork, we could see him emphasizing the deity of Christ that way. More likely, John, being the Old Testament scholar that he was, he's going back to Exodus and getting this from Exodus 24, verse 9 and 10, where Moses, Aaron, and the elders of Israel see the feet of the God of Israel. So that's another way that the deity of Christ is emphasized in verse 15. The other way would be the voice, which we discussed in our last study. The voice, when it says his voice was like the roar of many waters, that again links to the Septuagint, Ezekiel chapter 43, where the voice of God is described using these similar terms. So the feet point to his deity and the voice points to his deity in verse 15. And as we've been discussing, all these other aspects point to his deity as well in verse 12, 13, and 14. The feet refined in the furnace also reminds us of Daniel's 3 friends and the divine man with them in the fire. There may also be an intended contrast between Jesus' feet of bronze and the feet of clay from Daniel 2. The statue in Daniel 2, the feet were brittle and unstable, being made of clay mixed with iron, while Jesus' feet are firmly planted and stable, having been refined, tested in the fire. So Jesus is able to stand with his people as we are tested and tried in the fire. So the symbolism of his feet point to his divine status, his purity, his stability, his strength, and his trustworthiness. And Robert Thomas notes, quote, "The total impact of this feature of the description, then, is to bring attention to Christ's movement among the churches to inculcate purity. This inculcation was done by Christ's rendering of judgment in cases of moral shortcoming," end quote. So he's saying there that the purity of Christ being described by the being tested in the fire, the pure whiteness of his garments, pointing to his purity, and Christ's intent is transmitting that purity to the church, and he's doing that by rendering judgment in cases of moral shortcoming, so that we're transformed more and more into his likeness, which Paul also talks about in throughout his epistles, being transformed more and more into the likeness of Christ. So Jesus, our high priest, desires purity in our lives just as he is pure, and that's it seems to be part of what's in view here as well. So with that, we are going to conclude this study, and we'll pick up in our next study with verse 16. So thank you all for listening. God bless. I'll talk to you all very soon.